Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be going over one of my more favorite builds in general in Last Epoch, and that's going to be Infernal Aura Golem. So the concept of the build is to utilize the Pyre Golem setup, where it creates a damage over time aura, and you can use that for your clear and your single target, and you can scale it into endgame. Now, I want to be clear with this, as it seems like no matter what I do, no matter how much I try, no matter what I say, it seems like nobody ever gets the memo that sometimes when I make builds, they're not the best builds. They're not supposed to be the best builds. I like to test other setups, and sometimes, they're a little bit less good as other builds. Like, for instance, this build is not as good as Bone Nova Golem. Bone Nova Golem is significantly better than this build in terms of damage, in terms of quality of life, and in terms of gearing. So if you want a better Bone Golem build, that is the better Bone Golem build. But if you were to take that, mentality and push it further, then everyone in the game should be playing squirrels, right? And we aren't, because I hate squirrels. So, but let's just talk about the build, shall we? So the idea is we're building around Infernal Aura. This node makes it so that our golem consumes our skeletons and skeleton mages to do more damage with its AoE. Now, I played this build in the multiplayer test environment that we were invited to when 0.9 launched, and I absolutely just fell in love with the build, like instantly. Like, this build became one of my favorite builds ever, as just the clear felt monumental. The single target was good enough, and it was great. Now, the biggest problem, though, with, of course, that version was I could only get to like 200k ticks with a little bit of investment, and that was definitely a little bit less good than other builds. And I was like, okay, well, let's see what we can do to min-max it now that, there's more stuff in the game. And it turns out there is an insane interaction between one specific item and one specific skill with this setup. And that is the cycle of Putrescence, or however you pronounce that thing. I probably butchered it. So the idea with this ring is it makes it so that your volatile zombies revive themselves, you get minion spell damage percentage, and the most important part of the ring, it gives your minions a bunch of added flat poison damage to spells. This is added flat. It will add to their damage over time spells, and this is normally utilized to make puke zombies function. Now, puke zombies are absolutely terrible if you've ever played them, but it turns out the Infernal Aura on Bone Golem is a poison damage. It was like a spell damage over time spell, meaning that this flat gets added to the Bone Golem's aura, right? And this is enough flat to make it work, because I believe the base is like 25, like every other spell, meaning that 27 plus 27, it makes the majority of your damage poison. And there's a lot of benefits for doing that. Like, for instance, if all of our spell damage is poison damage, if we apply poison to the enemy, which reduces resistance up to 20 stacks, that's a bunch of penetration that we normally wouldn't get. So turning your spells into poison has a lot of benefits, and this is one of them, right? This is the first benefit. The second benefit is we get to utilize the nodes inside Aura of Decay. The first node that we want to talk about is the node that gives nearby minions 75% more poison damage. If you are nearby Bone Golem when he casts his Infernal Aura, he will get 75% more poison damage, and that will apply to the Poison RF, and that's really good. And also as well, we can run the node inside Aura of Decay that scales, right? That scales poison resistance into the negative based on your intelligence. And this means that not only can we get more poison damage, we can also reduce the enemy's resistances, and all of that combined with, of course, the normal Pyre Golem setup, this means that we can scale the numbers to a very decent value. So right now, we are ticking for like 300 to 400k on the dummy, and it's just like every other spell damage over time setup where it ticks like 3 times per second, which is pretty good for endgame. That is good enough. That is like what I would call good enough. It's not like the most amazing single target, but the clear makes up for it, because when you get everything set up and everything hits right, your golem consumes the right amount of minions, your next to your golem He's got Dreadshade on top of him. His clear feels phenomenal. He just walks around and melts everything around it with a Poison RF, which is really fun. Now, there's a few problems with this build. It requires a little bit of maintenance. You gotta like play like a StarCraft player, you know, you gotta do some DPI shenanigans. And what do I mean by that? Well, Dreadshade, the way it works, when you apply it to a minion, it will apply it to the nearest minion to your cursor. So for instance, if you have a bunch of skeletons spawned, you won't end up applying Dreadshade to your Bone Golem. And this is very important because because Dreadshade has a node in it that gives your minion 60% more damage, but it removes the aura, like the aura part, meaning that when you use it on like a skeleton, your Bone Golem isn't going to get the 60% more damage. And since Infernal Shade, the Infernal Aura, it snapshots for when he casts it, that means that if he casts it without having Dreadshade on him, he doesn't get any of the benefits from Dreadshade for the next 10 seconds or however long his cooldown is. I think his cooldown's to like 8 seconds or 7 seconds or something. I haven't tested it entirely. But overall, that means that, of course, guess what? It's a little annoying to play with. So I found the way to play the build in the most efficient way possible. Now, what you do is you need to make sure that your skeletons are sitting next to your golem, and whenever your skeletons are eaten by your golem, by the Infernal Aura, you always cast Dreadshade first, and then you summon the next round of skeletons. As you can tell in my footage, I'll put the Dreadshade on them because it'll, target the nearest minion, which will only be the Bone Golem if he ate all your skeletons. And then, of course, then you can summon all your skeletons again to get all the boosts, because you got to keep feeding that fire, unironically, right? Now, this gameplay, it's for the most part fine. One of the biggest problems that I have with the current build that I'm playing is I wasn't able to shove any cooldown recovery speed into the build, and cooldown recovery speed, the more you have, the better this build gets, because being able to pull your golem around with your teleport spell, or in this case, skeletal summon mage, right, it makes it feel much better. So overall, the build's been great. I do want to go in game and I want to talk about the build more in detail, but if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leave a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. Also as well, tell me down below, do you guys like longer intros like this? If you want, I can make longer intros like this more often. With all that being said, let's go in game. So here we are in game with the character. This is the golem setup here. Let's talk about the skills, shall we? So for Bone Golem itself, we take 1 point travel into Amalgam of Rogues, 5 points into Burning Bones because that 50% more damage, 1 point into Pyre Golem, of course, to turn our golem into a fire golem, 5 points into World Pyre to make the infernal area huge. As you can tell, the infernal area is the circle here. Then as well, 1 point into Bone Kindling so that it consumes mages and skeletons to make our Bone Golem's Pyre do a lot of damage. So we're essentially feeding the golem skeletons to make it bigger. Now, as you can tell, my golem is casting its Bone Fire Golem, like its Bone Pyre, constantly, right? And that is because I have a little bit of cooldown recovery speed. I would say like 40% minion cooldown recovery speed is required to make it so that he constantly casts his thing on cooldown. Because if you do not have cooldown, he will not cast it constantly, which is something you want. You want him to constantly be casting this, because without it, he doesn't have 100% uptime. So cooldown recovery speed is mandatory for the build to function properly in endgame. So then we take 1 point travel to Amalgam of Sentinels, 1 point travel to Tower of Bones, then 1 point to Fragment of the Fallen for 25% more damage. Then eventually we take 5 points out of Amalgam of Mages for the more spell damage. And if you manage to get like a +4 to Bone Golem Helmet or something like that, you just put more points into Charred Bones. It's not like the most efficient thing ever, but it's definitely like good enough. You could grab stuff like size and threat generation. You could grab things like health and armor, or you could grab like movement speed or like health on hit, stuff like that. There's a lot of different things you could do. Definitely speeding up the golem in terms of attack speed and movement speed is a good idea though, because the faster he attacks, the more he moves around between targets. Because what happens is the aura will kill things faster than his melee attacks and all that, so he'll spend time doing animations for his melee attacks that are essentially pointless. So as you can tell, a lot of in our tree here, we grab an insane amount of minion attack and cast speed, even though we are a essentially a non like attack speed minion build, and that is mainly because the golem spends forever doing animations, and we want to reduce the time of those animations because the less time he's doing animations, the more times he's walking around to new enemies, and the more times he's walking around to new enemies, the better our clear speed is. So you definitely want to be reducing the amount of time that he's standing still doing animations. So grabbing the attack speed here, eventually grabbing 5 out of 5 and frantic summons and stuff like that is definitely a thing you want to be doing. So when you get the +4. Now, for our skeletons here, we only care about the max skeletons. We care about the mana gained on skeleton death. We care about summoning 3 skeletons, and then we care about removing archers. The reason why we want to remove archers is because our golem is a melee minion, and you want the skeletons to be on the same kind of around him when it happens. Like, for instance, you want your skeletons to be near to be killed, right? So if they are not near the golem, like if they're archers standing away, they will not be killed by the aura. So you want to have melee minions, right? And of course, everything else is just for extra skeletons and stuff. As you can tell, this takes a lot of mana to summon all these skeletons, right? But whenever our bone golem does, of course, the thing, I'm waiting, it will put our mana back to full, and we don't need a lick of mana regen. We don't need anything like that, and this essentially keeps us sustained on mana. This is a very mana neutral build. Now let's talk about Skeletal Mage here. Skeletal Mage has a few things we need to grab. The first thing being Death Knights. We need Death Knights so that our Skeletal Mages are melee minions, so that, of course, they fight in the same range that our Bone Golem does, so that they get consumed properly. Then, of course, we grab Grave Passage to turn our Skeletal Mage into a traversal skill, then grab 3 points into Death's Cavalry. Now, whenever I am clearing monoliths, the concept of my bar is what I'll do is I'll wait for him to consume. I'll cast Dreadshade because he'll be the only minion around, and then I'll cast 2 casts of skeletons, and then of course like as many casts of Skeletal Mage as you can. And what this does is it kind of normalizes the button presses and makes sure that you're not like spending forever maintaining your golem. This is like the optimal way of playing, and it's the main way. Now, of course, when you get skeletons summoned like this, what you want to do is like just maintain your skeleton count like 6 so that you always summon your bone golem with you with Death's Cavalry. Eventually, you want to invest into some cooldown recovery speed so that, you know, of course, you can bring them faster with you and all that eventually. Now, one problem is eventually when EHG fixes this node. So like for instance, this node right now, it counts as a traversal skill, but this is additively, it is not stacking with the movements with the boot modifier, the experimental boot modifier that makes it so that, you know, minions move with you using a traversal skill. Our Skeletal Mage counts as a traversal skill, but it's not adding the extra teleport minions, which should be additive with this node. It is not currently additive with this node. Once that node is additive with the skeletal traversal, we can actually just cast as many skeletons as we want. And no matter what we do, our whole entire posse will always be teleported with us. But that will be when they fix this node. And this build will get significantly better because of that in terms of quality of life. Now for Dreadshade, we're doing a solo minion setup, and thankfully we're not playing a crit build, so we don't have to put a ridiculous cooldown on our Dreadshade. But we also, what we make sure we do is, of course, grabbing the more damage here, right? 60% more damage. We grab the attack and cast speed here so that he spends less time doing his animations. 1 point the Lone Watcher for the insane duration, so it brings it to 40 seconds. So you only have to like cast Dreadshade on him every 40 seconds, which is a huge quality of life boost, meaning you don't have to spend forever constantly, you know, spamming your stuff. 4 points into the necrotic damage because it gives poison chance to your minions around you, and you want to give the golem poison chance so that he can apply poisons for himself, so that of course he can get the shred stacks for his poison aura, right? Then of course 1 point into all for one, so we can get the 60% more damage. Just remember, this makes it so that there's no aura buffs, meaning that you always have to make sure that he is cast on, but this is the most optimal way of doing as much DPS as possible. You could not run this node if you wanted more quality of life, so you don't have to, like, you can just cast a bunch of Dread Shades and be fine. But in my opinion, it is more efficient to use all for one and just simply work on a rotation like I was talking about. Then, of course, for Aura of Decay. Aura of Decay is integral for this build's functionality, and that is for a few reasons. The first reason is we get 75% more damage. Now, remember, we have to be nearby the Bone Golem when he casts his Infernal Shade here, Infernal Aura. I'm waiting for it. You have to be nearby him, because if you're not nearby him and the aura of area of effect, it means that he will not get the 75% more damage for the entirety of the aura's effect. So you need to be near him, otherwise you will not get you will not get as much damage. That is why when we eventually invest into more cooldown, once I get more cooldown, more stuff like that, I can spam him with me and keep him nearby me. Eventually, you want to get to the point where you're just pulling him with you through the monoliths once you get enough cooldown. Like I said, I have no cooldown, but eventually when you get to this down to like 2-second cooldown, you want to just pull him with you constantly, which is like the preferred method of transportation once you eventually get that node, which will keep this up all the time. We also grab this node, Fume Weaver, enemy poison resistance per intelligence. This reduces enemy poison resistance here. So for instance, 67%, we're penning for 67%. We also, I think we get the pen from the shred from poison pen, which is like 20% or something like that. I can't remember exactly how many poisons. I can't remember how many it stacks to, but like this on top of the poison shred here. And of course the poison shred from actual poisons, we deal like 100 to 120% more damage or something like that, which means that when you're on a boss, you need to be near to the boss and you also need to be near your golem. So this is a very melee-centric build. You want to be near enemies, you want to be near your golem, so you need to like stay near stuff. And to do that, we need to be tanky, right? Everything else about this build other than making Pyro Golem do damage is about being tanky. And that is thanks to this node called Absence of Life. Absence of Life, the reason why this is so strong is because it heals your percentage health every tick. So like for instance, if I have 50% HP, it'll heal 8% of that missing HPs, which would be like 4% of my life. Now, this can scale with healing effectiveness, right? So I have about 400% healing effectiveness. So if I'm at 50% HP now, I heal for about 20% of my HP if I'm at 50% missing, which is like half of my missing, right? So this essentially makes it so if you watch my footage, as I take more and more damage as I go lower, my healing gets better. So essentially what it does, as long as we have our endurance capped, we are very tanky. We can take hits, we can heal them instantly back thanks to Aura of Decay. It ticks every second, and eventually you could scale this up to ridiculous values. Right now I'm only at 400% because I don't have all of my healing effectiveness stuff, but overall, eventually when you fine-tune the build, get more healing effectiveness on your rings, which I have none right now, these can get LP on them, stuff like that, you can start scaling this number to the moon and get very, very tanky very, very quickly thanks to this. And this is how we're sustaining our HP on this build, and it makes it feel really good, by the way. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the skills. Let's talk about the passives that are important. So for the passives that are important, the main thing, like I said, minion attack speed. You want to stack as much intelligence as possible to shred enemy poison resistance, and of course that increases the flat HP that the Pyro Golem has. Increased HP and flat HP, we want as much HP as possible because the Aura of Decay node scales with our HP. So the more HP that we have, the better. And of course, minion health is good. Lich here, intelligence. This mana regen is pretty nice. As much HP as possible. 2 points here, and then eventually 8 points to crippling insight for the insane amount of intelligence. We don't care about health regen at all. 8 points into Risen Army for, of course, the cast speed eventually. Then 10 points to Mortal Tether for the increased minion health. We want to grab as many max skeletons as possible because this is a multiplicative modifier to the rest of our damage. We're, of course, grabbing Mark for Punishment, which marks for death for 8 seconds. This is essentially 100% uptime on bosses as long as we're doing our loop, which is another negative 25% resistances on top of everything else. Then eventually 5 points to the Frantic Summons, 3 points Travel to River of Bones, 10 points to the Heresy for the intelligence, of course, 10 points to Rite of Undeath. You can actually start taking out of these nodes and going into Cling to Life and Empty the Graves to grab Disciples of Necromancy. Eventually, once you get enough resistance on here. Now, you could start grabbing all of the flat everywhere else. You could grab the flat inside the golem tree, but this would be insanely inefficient because that damage wouldn't be affected by this, and the damage wouldn't be affected by this. So essentially, if you invest into flat that isn't poison, it starts to be what you would call it inefficient. This node's really strong, as it's one of the main reasons why Necromancer is really good, because it's reduced minion health. It's like whatever, but we really want that increased health because that, like I said, that stacks with our, of course, everything that we're doing. The more health we have, the tankier we get because of Aura of Decay. So eventually, if you hit like 4k HP, you will be an absolute titan, a juggernaut, amazing. We go for a shield, of course, for the healing effectiveness as well, which is even stronger, right? Everything about this is great when it comes to the Aura of Decay setup. And it's very cheap to set up too. It's not like as if you need a vessel setup, which is one of the best things about it. So that's pretty much it for the passives. Let's talk about blessings. So for blessings, eventually you want Void Res here. I don't have it because I didn't have the time to farm it. Eventually here you want you specifically want Lightning Res, of course. That would save you some gearing. Here you want Crit Avoid, of course. I'm very close to cap on this. Did not hit 69 Sag. You want armor percentage here, and then you want, of course, armor flat here, so you can scale your flat armor. I don't have much flat armor scaling right now, and that is mainly because my base types are very low. I don't have like armor percent on my shield. I don't have a good base type on my helmet. And we also don't have access to the node here, Empty the Graves. We would have access to this node eventually once we have Rite in Death, and that would give us a lot of flat armor too. And all of that combined would keep us pretty chonky. Now, that's pretty much it for blessings. Now, let's talk about gearing. So for idols, like I said, mandatory like 40% cooldown, I think. I think 40% would be perfect. So like 2 of these essentially would be great. And then eventually you want to have 4 of like 2 of these or 4 of these or whatever, as many as you can possibly get for that juicy healing effectiveness, and then fill the blanks with healing effectiveness idols and resistance idols. That is what you want to have in the end game, as this is all your sustain, because you don't have that many damage idols, right? But idols like this would give us HP and minion cooldown recovery speed. So like spam these and spam these, essentially healing effect. And probably HP on the suffix. I can't remember what else gets on the suffix. Maybe poison res on the suffix. I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember what's on suffixes. And that's pretty much it for idols. It's not about gearing. You require 2 cycles of Putrescence to scale into endgame. You could actually play a non-poison version of this build, grabbing charred bones, grabbing all the flat here and all that, right? You could do that. You could take out of the node in Dreadshade, which removes the necrotic damage here instead of grabbing this node. But eventually what you could do, like I said, like you could do that. Now, you could do that for leveling, but I would heavily suggest trying to get cycles as fast as possible. And to swap over it, you need both cycles. You cannot do it with 1 cycle or 1 cycle. You need both cycles, and you preferably need the max rule, because this is all of your base damage. This is the entirety of your base damage. This is all your base damage you care about, because you are scaling poison damage over time insanely hard. This is what you care about. You want max rolls on this thing. Every single rune of Ascendance you have should be spent on getting LP cycles of Putrescence that have good rolls. Like, this is essentially what you want. This is exactly what you want. You want to hard go into this. And that's after you get access to a Reach of the Grave. Reach of the Grave, it makes it so that your minions leech your spell damage. So for instance, he has an aura, right? He will leech from this damage, and this will make it so that your golem doesn't instantly die. Because one of the biggest problems with golem right now is if he doesn't have any sources of leech, he will die. Like in your monoliths and stuff, he will take enough damage. You don't have any scaling to minion health regen, stuff like that. You don't want to waste into that. So we use a Reach of the Grave. Reach of the Grave is our best in slot. You would use Runes of Ascendance for this first while you're leveling, and then you would move into this. Now for chests here, eventually you want +4 to Bone Golem, but this is like a fine helmet. You'd want the minion cooldown recovery speed, because there's a helmet with minion, like 20% minion cooldown recovery speed, and that would reduce the amount of minion cooldown recovery speed you need to make him have 100% uptime. Amulet here, this is pretty good amulet, other than the fact that could be minion damage on the other prefix, which is fine. Like I said, chest here, intelligence. You want to stack as much intelligence as humanly possible. You want intelligence everywhere. Everywhere you can shove it, you're going to put intelligence there. And of course, you could have like minion health here on the prefix as well, so you can have less minion health elsewhere. Shield, healing effectiveness, block chance, armor percent, health. We kind of care about block, but we kind of don't. We mainly want armor, HP, and healing effectiveness. This is essentially a stat stick. We do get access to block. It is cool that we have block, but we don't rely upon it. It's just simply an extra defensive layer. But we mainly care about getting our armor stats up higher, right? And of course, for our ring here, cycles, of course. Eventually, you want intelligence, minion damage, HP, resistances, crit avoid, stuff like that, those stats, right? Belt here, minion health, minion damage. You don't need that minion health regen at all. You don't need that minion health regen at all. You want the minion damage specifically. Then health, and then, like, that's fine. And then for the gloves, intelligence, like I said, everywhere. Minion damage is fine. Right now, I have a 67 intelligence and 460% minion health. This is around where you want to be for your bone golem to be tanky enough to tank everything and leech from his damage, right? This is about like where I'd say he's perfect. Now, of course, you might have a problem later on where your skeletons are dying to things. This is not a build that would be pushing into higher corruption, so don't worry about it. Don't push it higher than 300. 300 is a good spot. You don't need to be higher than that for a build like this. And of course, health, endurance, health, whatever. Getting endurance capped is really strong, like I said, because of how Aura Decay works, like I explained earlier. Boots here, intelligence, movement speed, HP. Eventually, you can invest into that minion teleport affix, but we don't have access to that because it is bugged with, of course, Summon Skeletal Mage, sadly. Then relic here, minion damage, intelligence, healing effectiveness, HP, resistance. This could be on the minion movement speed base. This could be on the poison resistance base. There's a lot of different bases this could be on, but that's completely fine. Like whatever you end up there. And that's pretty much it for this character. Like I said, the buy-in is Reach of the Grave, and then the upgrades is cycles. You want to swap into cycles when you have 2 cycles. You don't want 1 cycle, you want 2 cycles. Either you go the minion fire necrotic way with like the necrotic flat from here, the necrotic and minion fire here, you scale that. And then you swap into cycles once you have both of them. Of course, you can use this in the other version, so like both versions, right? And that's pretty much it for the character. That's pretty much it for the build. Now, with all that being said, this has been Jed. Tell me if you guys like longer videos like this where I explain things more. With all that being said, bye.